A harsh screech of metal on metal split the stillness of the desert highway as Luke Carter jammed his foot on the brake tires, smoking against the cracked asphalt. His old pickup's axle snapped like a brittle bone, sending the bed twisting and sparks flying into the dusky sky. 8-year-old Ethan Carter's wide eyes met his father's through the shattered windshield, a silent question hanging between them. What now? Luke's heart pounded as he killed the engine, the world around them suddenly too vast and empty. Sand whipped across the road, and the last rays of a blood-red sun dipped below the horizon. With a deep breath, Luke yanked open the door, bracing himself against the shock of the strange, lonely place and whatever, or whoever, might arrive next. If you've ever wondered how far a single act of kindness can change everything, drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and ring the bell so you don't miss a minute of this journey. Luke Carter's boots crunched against the gravel shoulder as he stepped away from his dying truck toolbox, clutched in one hand like a split-second lifeline. The Texas wind tugged at his work shirt, carrying a hint of sagebrush and the promise of trouble. Ethan scrambled out of the cab, clutching his well-worn stuffed rabbit, his small frame trembling in the dusk. Luke squatted beside his son, smoothing back a tousled lock of hair and forcing a reassuring smile. "We'll figure this out, buddy," he said, though uncertainty burned in his gut. They were miles from the nearest town, their last promising hope swallowed by rolling plains and skeletal mesquite. Luke had driven this truck from Denver, chasing rumors of honest work and cheaper rent. Now the fuel pump lay in shattered ruin beneath the hood, and phone service had been dead for hours. As the sky bled into full night, Luke unpacked his flashlight and knelt to inspect the damage. Rust streaked the pump. Wires were chewed and frayed. He exhaled, wiping sweat from his brow. "Not tonight," he muttered. A distant rumble echoed over the open fields. Luke looked up, scanning the horizon. The rumble grew louder, a green pickup barreling toward them, headlights slicing through the gathering dark. Panic fluttered in Ethan's chest, but Luke held his gaze steady. The stranger pulled to a stop, dust billowing in her wake. She climbed down each confident stride, announcing experience. Work gloves stained with dirt rolled up sleeves, revealing strong forearms, and chestnut hair pulled into a loose braid framed hazel eyes that took in the scene with precise curiosity. Broken down, her voice was calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. She offered a hand, calloused but unafraid. "Name's Harper Monroe. I run the farm up the road. That pump's shot, but I can give you a tow and a place to stay while you get sorted." Luke rose, studying her. He wasn't used to charity, especially not from strangers. Thanks. I can pay you back." Harper waved a dismissive hand. "Don't worry about money. I need someone who knows a hammer from a wrench." She crouched to peer under the hood, nodding at his tools. "You look handy." Within minutes, she'd hooked a heavy-duty tow line to his truck's frame. Luke climbed into her green pickup. Ethan perched beside him, clutching his rabbit. The cab smelled of engine oil and fresh leather. As they pulled away, Luke caught a glimpse of Harper through the rearview mirror, a steely figure guiding them toward unknown possibilities. The road to Harper's farm wound through fields dotted with grazing horses and rows of ripening crops. Moonlight cast long shadows on the fertile earth, illuminating the silhouette of a weathered barn in the distance. The farmhouse glowed with warm lamplight, like a beacon against the night. Ethan pressed his nose to the window, awe in his eyes. "Is it real, Dad?" "It's as real as we need it to be," Luke replied, voice low with cautious hope. They stopped in front of a small guest house beside the main house. Harper climbed out and offered them water and blankets. The guest house was modest running water, a small kitchenette, a soft bed Ethan's height. Luke set his tools inside, heart pounding with relief. Before turning in, Luke walked back to the barn's silhouette, imagining its battered beams and leaky roof. He felt a strange kinship with the place, both weathered, both in need of repair. Harper joined him, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. The air was crisp, tinged with earth and promise. "You sure you don't want rent?" Harper asked, handing him a mug. Luke took a sip, savoring the bitter warmth. "Tomorrow, after I see what I'm up against." He glanced up at the barn. "Mind if I take a look?" Together they stood in silence beneath a sky spangled with stars. The barn loomed before them, sagging beams and missing planks outlined in silver. Ethan poked his head around the guest house door. Can I help? Harper smiled, eyes softening. Sure you can, champ, tomorrow morning. Luke nodded at his son, protective pride stirring in his chest. Then he turned to Harper, grateful beyond words. Thank you for everything. She lifted her mug in a quiet toast. Welcome home, Luke Carter. As Luke climbed the guest house stairs, he felt the weight of the road slip from his shoulders. Tonight, for the first time in months, sleep came unbidden. Outside the farm rested under a velvet sky, ready for the dawn and whatever it would bring. Luke woke before the sun, eyelids heavy, but his mind already racing. He sat on the edge of the guest house bed toolbox at his feet like a talisman. Across the room, Ethan stirred blanket tangled around his legs. Luke ran a hand through his own hair, the early light painting the room in pale gold. He thought of Denver, of the cramped apartment where he'd learned to sleep, standing up of the hospital hallway where he'd fought to keep Faith alive while Emily slipped away. 2 years later, the wounds were still raw, the loss and ache he carried in every muscle. But here under this wide Texas sky, the air felt different, brighter, as if hope could grow like the wheat in the fields beyond. He nudged Ethan awake gently. Morning, kiddo, he murmured. Ethan's eyes opened, blue flecks catching the light. Morning, Dad? He yawned, pulling the rabbit toy to his chest. Outside, he could hear Harper's truck door close with a decisive thud. Luke's jaw set. Time to get to work. They stepped onto the porch together, chilly dew soaking through the soles of their boots. In the distance, Harper's taillights winked like embers fading into night. Luke's chest tightened. He needed to catch up, needed to show her he wasn't just a drifter or a charity case. He hefted the toolbox and led Ethan down the gravel path toward the barn, each step crunching beneath their feet. As they walked, memories came unbidden. Denver mornings at dawn. Emily's hair splayed on the pillow as she dreamed, the fiery crash that stole her from him, the hollow ache of solo parenthood. Bills piled up so high he'd learned to ignore the letters slipping beneath the apartment door. He hadn't planned on falling apart, but grief has a way of exposing every weakness, every fear. And for too long, Luke had run from creditors, from memories, from himself. The barn came into focus, a skeleton of wooden beams and rusted metal roof, patched with mismatched boards like bruised skin. Moonlight shimmered on a broken window pane, casting fractured shapes across the ground. Ethan's breath hitched. It's huge, he whispered. Luke crouched beside his son, pointing to a loose plank. We'll make it sturdy again, he promised. He tested the barn door and it groaned, nearly tipping on its hinges. Gotta start with that, he said, pulling a worn hammer from the toolbox. He swung an experimental tap against the frame, and winced rust and rot had softened the wood more than he'd hoped. He glanced at Ethan's worried face. Don't worry, we'll fix it. Ethan nodded, but his father saw the doubt. Luke squared his shoulders. Come on, he said, leading the boy inside where the scent of hay was thick and comforting. He laid the toolbox on a dusty crate and flipped open the lid, revealing rows of chisels, nails, and worn leather gloves. He chose a stout nail and tapped it in where the wood still held firm, then grabbed a beam that sagged too low and wedged a temporary brace beneath it. It would hold until daylight. Outside, the horizon blushed pink. Harper emerged from her truck carrying 2 steaming mugs. She moved with the ease of someone born to this land, her boots scuffed in a way that told stories of 1,000 dawns rising. Coffee, she asked, holding out a mug to Luke and another to Ethan. The liquid was smoky and strong, exactly what he needed. He accepted it with a nod, warmth seeping into his cold hands. Thanks, he said softly. He didn't need to remind her he was a carpenter. She'd seen his hands, knuckles, calloused fingers scarred from years of grasping hammers and saws. Tell me more about this place, he said, leaning against the barn's corrugated wall. Harper took a slow sip, eyes drifting across the fields. My family's been here 3 generations. This barn was my grandpa's pride and joy. He built it by hand after coming home from the war. She let out a dry chuckle. Had dances in here back when the county fair was the biggest event around. Her gaze sharpened. Then he died right in those fields. Heart gave out. Folks started selling land, moving on. I stayed. Guess I was too stubborn to leave. Luke listened, picturing her grandfather hammering boards side by side with neighbors, music drifting on summer wind. He recognized her stubborn pride. He'd worn it too when he'd refused help after Emily's accident, when he'd turned down friends because he didn't want to feel weak. Now, sitting here, coffee in hand, he felt a kinship, a spark of something more than obligation. Ethan crouched to watch a pair of horses grazing near the fence. "Can we feed them later?" he asked. Luke exchanged a look with Harper. "Sure thing, buddy. First we fix the barn, then we earn a few carrots." Harper cracked a smile, a glint of amusement in her eyes. "He's got a good deal there, Luke." He took another sip of coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. "Speaking of good deals, I'll need lumber," he said, eyeing the barn's missing planks. "Do you have extra boards? Or know where we can get some?" She glanced toward the farmhouse where the porch light still burned. "I've got some stored near the shed. Come on." They walked back toward the house, Ethan skipping ahead. Luke followed, toolbox swinging at his side. He had begun to believe forgiveness could exist in quiet moments like these, between sips of coffee, between hammer strikes under a dawn sky. He remembered the day he first held Emily's hand in the hospital, how her warmth had chased away every doubt. He'd never believed he'd feel that alive again until now. Harper led them to a small lean-to beside the tool shed where weathered boards leaned against the wall. Luke ran his fingers along the grain oak, still solid despite the years. He lifted one, testing its weight. "Perfect," he said, loading 3 into the back of Harper's truck. Ethan helped, grinning as he balanced each plank. Inside the shed, an old map of the property was tacked to the wall, a web of fields and fence lines dotted with notes in Harper's precise script, spring wheat irrigation fix beehives. She pointed at a patch near the barn. "This used to be pasture for Holsteins. We might bring them back once the barn's secure." Luke considered that. That'd bring in steady work, and I could help with stalls, too. He caught her eye. "If you'll have me." She stared, her lips curving in a small, genuine smile. "You're already here." Back at the barn, Luke and Ethan set to work. Luke measured and cut hammering boards into place, while Ethan held nails and fetched tools. The rhythm of saw against wood, hammer against nail, soothed him. Each new board reinforced not just the structure, but something in his spirit roots taking hold where before there had been only drift. By midday, the barn door swung true hinges, silent and smooth. Luke tested it again, then stood back, chest swollen with quiet pride. He glanced at Harper, whose eyes shone with relief. Ethan cheered, clapping his hands. Luke ruffled his son's hair. "Looks like we did it." Harper crossed her arms, pretending to inspect his work. "Not bad, Carter." She used his last name like she'd known him forever, and in that moment he felt part of something bigger. A team. A family. He wiped sweat from his brow, setting aside his hammer. "What's next?" Her answer came in a laugh, richer than any music he'd ever heard. "Let's feed those horses, then. I've got a fence that could use some persuasion." Luke grabbed his hat, looping the strap of the toolbox over his shoulder. Ethan hopped off the crate, rabbit in hand. Together they followed Harper into the midday sun toward fields that held more promise with every step. And as they moved, Luke Carter felt the weight of the past ease just enough that he could finally look forward and believe that maybe, just maybe, this was where he was meant to be. The first light of dawn slipped between the ragged slats of the barn's boarded-up windows, painting the dusty floorboards gold. Luke Carter stepped forward, the morning chill still clinging to the air, and surveyed the damage through a carpenter's practiced eye. Every beam bowed under invisible weight, every shingle missing or cracked told its own story of long years left untended. Ethan Carter stood quietly beside him, clutching his rabbit toy as if it too were a talisman against the unknown. Neither spoke words felt too heavy for such a moment, but Luke could sense Ethan's curiosity, his silent question. What now? Across the yard, Harper Monroe watched them from the farmhouse porch. The haze of dawn softened her silhouette, but there was no doubt in her stance. She folded her arms, hat tipped back on her head, and waited. When Luke finally turned to her, she beckoned with a single nod and called across the space. "Morning," she said, voice steady. "You see what I'm dealing with?" He swallowed, stepping off the worn path and onto the loose gravel that led to the barn door. "I do." His gaze swept over the framework rotted posts where wood once gleamed, a half-collapsed lean-to on one side, and the barn's massive doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. He ran his hand along the edge of a broken board, splinters pricking his palm. "This place has history. You don't want to tear it down. Harper dropped her arms and pulled a folded paper from her pocket, a sketch of the old barn drawn years ago when it still stood proud. She handed it to Luke, her fingers brushing his wrist in the exchange. My grandfather used to say a carpenter's touch could bring life back to anything she said. Her hazel eyes locked on his. I can't pay you cash, but I need someone who knows his way around a hammer. I'll give you shelter meals and your son a safe place to run. You repair this barn and you'll have more than I can promise in town. Luke hesitated. Pride danced with desperation inside him. He'd left Denver with nothing but his toolbox and a head full of memories, some painful, some bittersweet. He'd crossed state lines on faith and rumor, chasing a chance to rebuild his life for Ethan. Now here was an offer that felt too good to be true. A home, meaningful work, a real fresh start. But no cash. He bristled. How could he feed his son without steady pay? Nights spent lying awake in that creaking guest house, bills piling higher than the barn rafters, sure as any paycheck in a factory. He glanced at Ethan, who had inched forward and was running his small hand along the side of the barn. The boy's eyes shone with a quiet excitement, as if he felt that this place could be theirs, a place where his laughter might echo off the wooden beams instead of bouncing off apartment walls. Luke inhaled the scent of hay and earth. He remembered Emily's gentle smile, the way she'd encouraged him to believe in second chances. He could almost hear her voice here. He met Harper's steady gaze. She didn't look away. Her offer was more than a job. It was trust. He straightened, bringing the paper sketch to his chest as if it were a shield. I'll do it, he said, voice low but firm. I'll fix your barn. He extended his hand. Harper stood brushing lint from her jeans before taking his hand in a firm shake. In that moment, the old wood structure behind them shifted from ruin to promise. The sun climbed higher, warming the cracked earth beneath their feet as they turned the latch on the barn door and stepped inside. The interior smelled of dust, old feed, and the lingering echo of hoofbeats from decades past. Luke clicked on his flashlight and swept the beam across broken stalls and scattered tools. Each piece of discarded equipment was an invitation, bring purpose back to this place, and you'll find it yourself. He knelt beside a rotted support beam, tapping it with the handle of his hammer. The hollow thud told him he'd need fresh oak posts at the very least. He stood and held out his hand to Ethan. Come on, buddy, let's get started. The boy climbed up onto a dusty crate, his small frame silhouetted against the rising sun. Luke passed him a dust mask and gloves. Safety first, he said, and Ethan nodded solemnly, as though he understood the weight of the work ahead. Outside, Harper was already unloading a pile of new lumber from her pickup boards cut to size 2x4s lined up like soldiers at attention. She carried a toolbox of her own, smaller and well-worn, but clearly kept by someone who knew how to use every tool inside. Luke let Ethan watch for a moment, then joined Harper at the stack. She handed him a carpenter's pencil and a tape measure. Together they marked the lengths they'd need, shoulders brushing as they worked in comfortable silence. As the morning sun climbed higher, Luke felt the familiar burn in his muscles, an ache he hadn't felt since the days when Emily still stood by his side in their old workshop. But this ache was different. It felt like progress, like each swing of the hammer drove away doubt. He cut and nailed, braced and lifted. Ethan fetched nails, held boards steady, and learned the rhythm of the work. By mid-morning, they'd replaced 2 main posts and reframed the door. Luke stepped back, sweat on his brow and dust clinging to his shirt. He wiped his forehead with a rag and took in the sight. Straight beams standing proud again, a doorway strong enough to swing open without protest. The barn breathed beneath his handiwork. Harper brought out a thermos of coffee and 3 tin mugs. She handed one to Ethan, filled with hot chocolate, and 2 to them. Luke took a long sip of coffee, relishing the bitterness as Ethan sipped with wide eyes. This is the best hot chocolate ever, the boy declared, and Luke couldn't help but smile. A moment ago he'd worried about feeding his son. Now he watched him sip chocolate in the shadow of a rebuilt doorway. Maybe it didn't have to be cash that sustained them here. Harper leaned against the newly straightened post and studied Luke. "You're good at this," she said softly. "Better than I even hoped." He shrugged, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I've done my fair share of projects, but this one, it matters more." He looked around the barn, imagining it filled with hay bales and the soft clop of horses' hooves. It's not just a building, it's history. He turned back to her. Thank you. Her gaze softened. Thank you for staying. She flipped her coffee mug in her hand. I didn't think anyone would take me up on it. They fell into step, moving deeper into the barn toward a rotted loft ladder. Ethan clambered up, first curiosity twinkling in his eyes as he peered into the dusty hayloft above. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the roof, illuminating forgotten tools and lengthening shadows. Luke climbed after him, heart pounding, as he stood in that quiet space with his son and the woman who'd given them a chance. Down below, Harper began measuring shingles she'd saved from the old barn. Together they would patch the roof, seal the cracks, and chase out the ghosts of neglect. Luke took a deep breath, looking at the two people who'd become his lifeline. Ethan holding tight to each new memory of father-son triumphs, and Harper offering not only her land but her trust. The old barn creaked as if waking from a long slumber. Luke placed a hand on the beam above him and felt a thrill of possibility. For the first time since Emily's passing, he didn't feel broken. He felt part of something worth repairing. And as the three of them worked side by side under the wide Texas sky, Luke Carter realized that sometimes the greatest offers come not with coin, but with the promise of renewal and the hands willing to build a new life together. The first light of morning filtered through the slats of the barn, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the cool air. Luke Carter cradled a chipped enamel mug of black coffee between calloused hands, steam curling upward in lazy spirals. It was the richest, most honest coffee he'd had in years, bitter, unpretentious, and exactly what he needed to wake up. He stood on the threshold of the barn, listening to the chorus of meadowlarks and mockingbirds as they greeted the dawn. Across from him, Harper Monroe leaned against a newly reinforced beam, her own mug pressed to her lips. Her eyes, the color of storm clouds, drifted across the worn floorboards they'd spent days repairing. The barn's great doors stood open behind them, now revealing rows of young saplings planted outside, evidence of her vision to restore the land. She took a slow sip of coffee, then set the mug down on a nearby crate with a thoughtful sigh. I miss Grandpa's dances, she said softly, voice carrying the weight of memory. Luke turned his gaze from the rising sun to her, curious. He'd seen photographs inside the farmhouse, black and white snapshots of laughter under lantern light, couples twirling in rough boots, music drifting between the rafters. But hearing her speak of it made the barn feel alive again. Harper ran a hand along the rough-hewn beam beside her. He built this barn after he came home from the war, said he wanted a place where neighbors could gather when there wasn't much else to celebrate. She paused, eyes distant. Friday night, someone would bring fiddles or a guitar, and the whole county would spill in kids chasing fireflies, old-timers swapping stories. I was too young to dance much, but I'd watch hiding behind the barrels, dreaming of the day I'd be up there too. Luke nodded, picturing her as a little girl, under those lights, wide-eyed and full of hope. He lifted his mug and offered her a quiet salute. Sounds like a place worth saving. She smiled, a flicker of warmth crossing her face. It was. Until he collapsed in those fields. She gestured toward the pasture beyond the barn's back wall, where wildflowers tipped in gold and scarlet grew tall. He was checking on the last of the cattle, said he just felt his heart stop. I found him resting against the fence post, eyes fixed on the sunset. He died doing what he loved. Her voice cracked and she took another sip of coffee, steadying herself. Luke's throat tightened. He remembered Emily's last hours on Earth, the frantic beeping of monitors, the hush that fell when there was nothing more to do. In Denver, he'd been too numb to grieve properly, always on the move, always chasing the next job or escape route. But here, under Harper's honest gaze and amidst the land steeped in generations of memories, his grief coalesced into something he could almost touch. I'm sorry, he said, his voice low. He set his mug on the crate beside hers, hands curling around the chipped rim. I know what it's like to lose someone doing what they love. He looked at the barn's sturdy frame, freshly bolted and braced. We lost my wife in an accident. I've been running ever since. Harper regarded him with quiet sympathy, her eyes softening. I knew there was more to your story, she admitted. Your hands aren't just good with a hammer. They've seen hard times. She set her mug down and squared her shoulders. I've always handled things myself, never wanted to depend on anyone. But when the developers first came calling with money, I couldn't refuse. I realized just how alone I really was. Luke watched her silhouette outlined by dawn light. She folded her arms, strength and vulnerability mingling in her posture. "I was going to sell," she said. "Easy money, a chance to start fresh somewhere else. But I couldn't do it. Not after Grandpa built this place with his own hands. Not after everything he stood for." He remembered the moment she'd offered him shelter without cash, the fierce pride in her voice as she refused payment. "You made the right call," he said, voice firm. "Places like this aren't measured in dollars. They're measured in lives saved in stories told in dreams built under open skies." She gave him a small half grin. "You sound like a preacher." Then more softly, "But I need this barn and my home to survive. I need someone I can trust, someone who doesn't walk away when things get hard." Luke felt a spark of understanding. He knew what it meant to walk away to leave town when rent came due to pack up memories like broken shards to teach his son that stability was a myth. But here on this ancient timber floor with Harper's pain echoing in his chest, he realized he didn't want to run anymore. "Trust me," he said, placing a hand over his heart. "I'm not going anywhere." He reached for his mug again, but paused. "Can I ask you something?" "Shoot," she replied, her eyes steady. He took a slow breath. "Why me? You could have asked anyone, any carpenter, any farmhand. Why bring me in stranger and all?" Harper looked down at her coffee. She traced the rim with her thumb, thoughtful. "Because when you showed up, you didn't pity me. You didn't offer charity. You offered to help. You treated this barn like it deserved respect." She met his gaze again, her voice quiet but certain. "I figured if you respected the place this much, you might respect what it means to me." Luke felt a lump in his throat, a mix of gratitude, sorrow, and something deeper he wasn't ready to name. He nodded, swallowing hard. "I respect it," he said. "And you?" He paused, his mind racing. "I lost my wife, but I won't lose this chance with my son. I need roots as much as this barn does." Ethan's voice drifted from the barn's entrance. "Dad, look!" The boy stood beneath one of Harper's trees, cradling a robin's nest in his small hands. 3 tiny bluish eggs nestled inside, and Ethan's eyes shone with wonder. Luke and Harper both set down their mugs and hurried over. Together they knelt at the base of the tree. Ethan's hand trembled as he ran a finger along the nest's rim. "They're real, Dad. They're gonna hatch." Harper crouched beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Promise you will keep this tree safe, buddy. Your mom would have loved these eggs." Luke's throat caught at the mention of Emily. He leaned down, brushing a strand of hair from Ethan's forehead. "We'll protect them," he vowed, "just like we'll protect this barn." Ethan grinned and slipped the nest back into its branch. The mother robin chirped from nearby, bold and bright, a song of new beginnings. The 3 of them watched until the bird settled over her eggs, then rose together, hearts a little lighter, as the sun climbed higher, warming the barn's wooden frame. Luke and Harper returned to the coffee crate. Their mugs were empty now, but the air between them was charged with something neither had felt in a long time: hope. Harper exhaled slowly, brushing dust from her jeans. "I've carried so much on my own," she said, voice soft. "Loss and responsibility and fear. It's a lot for one person." Luke folded his arms across his chest. "You don't have to carry it all," he said. "Not anymore." She looked at him, her storm gray eyes searching his. For a moment neither spoke, only the sound of birdsong and distant farm noises filled the silence. Then Harper's lips curved in a hesitant smile. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing." Luke tipped his mug toward her in a wordless toast. "To new chapters," he said, voice steady. Harper nodded. "To new chapters." They stood together in the morning light, 2 souls bound by coffee and confessions, by shared grief and the promise of rebuilding something enduring. The barn behind them was more than an old structure now. It was the foundation of a new life, one neither of them would have to face alone. And as the sun rose fully over the fields, Luke Carter realized that sometimes the strongest beams are forged in honesty and held together by hearts willing to trust again. The sun had climbed higher before they paused for a mid-morning break, long enough to wipe the sweat from their brows and lean against the newly repaired fence line. Luke braced his hands on his hips, chest heaving as the warm breeze carried the scent of wild grasses and fresh-cut wood. Behind him, Ethan darted through the tall golden stalks, laughter echoing across the field as he pursued a scruffy tan dog that had wandered in from who knows where. The dog twisted and bounded, tongue-lolling, turning the chase into a game of zigzag pursuit that drew hearty chuckles from both boy and beast. Harper stood a few yards away by the tool shed, her hands resting on her hips, watching with bright eyes. The morning light turned her hair to spun copper, and she let out a soft, unguarded laugh when Ethan finally scooped up the dog in his arms, burying his face in its fur. Luke watched the scene, chest tightening with a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. Kindness, real, unforced kindness, wasn't a stranger here. It lingered in the laughter and the way Harper's shoulders relaxed as she smiled in the careful way Ethan cradled the dog, as if it were his best friend. He lifted his hammer, gripping the wooden handle like a promise, and bent to drive the next post into the earth. The center of the post aligned with a chalked mark on the ground, and he raised the hammer overhead. With each strike, the post sank deeper, settling into its place, as if anchoring something far greater than wire and wood. The rhythmic thunk resonated in his bones, each blow sealing him more firmly into this life, this moment. By the time the post was flush with the ground, Luke had sweated through half his shirt. He leaned on the top of the hammer, breathing deeply, and allowed himself a quick glance toward Harper. She'd crossed her arms beneath her chest, tilting her head, and there was a spark in her storm-gray eyes, something like admiration mixed with curiosity. Luke's breath caught, and for a heartbeat neither of them moved. Then she turned away, busying herself by wiping down a set of pliers, but Luke felt the electric pull of those few seconds more keenly than any gust of wind. "Great work," she called out, voice carrying lightly. "That post is plumb and level." He straightened, nodding, and stepped back to survey the line of posts, a neat row, now standing proud, ready to support sturdy wire. "Looks solid," he said, wiping his palm against his jeans. He tugged the hammer free of its cradle on his belt and zipped his jacket halfway up, preparing to wind the wire. Harper joined him at the fence, carrying a coil of galvanized wire that gleamed in the sun. She tossed one end toward him, and he caught it without a word. Together they fed the wire between each post, looping it around the carved grooves and twisting it tight with special pliers. Side by side, their arms brushed occasionally, sending a pleasant sting through Luke's forearms. He felt the brush of her sleeve against his skin and paused to look at her, catching her off guard. She met his gaze, eyebrows raised, and then her mouth curved into a small, knowing smile. She reached up, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear, as if she'd been caught daydreaming. Ethan's distant yelp of delight broke the spell. He'd managed to coax the dog into a gentle trot beside him, and the pair were galloping back toward the fence like two old friends reunited. The scene tugged at Luke's heart, his son finally lighthearted again after so much upheaval. The friendly mutt swinging alongside him, Harper's unguarded smile as she watched. It felt like a dream he'd once believed impossible, a family of three, rebuilding on open land that cared more about hard work than banknotes. The dog skidded to a stop at the fence line and looked up at Harper, panting. Ethan bounded behind it, scratching behind its ears. "Dad, look!" the boy exclaimed. "He likes it here." The dog barked in agreement, tail wagging so hard its whole body shivered. "You have a way with animals," Harper observed, stepping forward to pat the dog's head. The dog leaned into her touch, eyes closing in bliss. She turned to Luke. "You're pretty good with a fence, too. You ever thought of staying on as part of the permanent crew?" Luke exchanged a quick glance with Ethan, who was now crouched beside the dog, whispering something into its ear. He cleared his throat, heart thudding. I've been thinking about that," he admitted. "It's honest work, and it means I don't have to keep running." Harper's gaze softened. "I've seen a lot of people come and go." "But you stuck with the barn. You stuck with the fence. That means something." He reached down to rinse his hands in a nearby trough, the cool water washing away sawdust and sweat. When he turned back, Harper stood closer, her hair catching the breeze like a fiery banner. The light gleamed off her freckles, and his chest tightened at the sight. She handed him the wire's end, eyes not quite meeting his. There was a vulnerability there, an unspoken question about whether he'd stay through thick and thin. Luke took the wire and began the first loop around the post. Her proximity made it hard to think, but he focused on the work, twisting the wire tight, securing it just so. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly, and she lifted her eyes to his, nodding as the words sank in. They worked in silent harmony, the only sounds the twang of wire, the labored breathing from their exertion, and distant birdsong. Each completed section of fence felt like another affirmation of partnership, wood and metal uniting under their shared effort. As the final wire snapped into place, Luke stepped back and laid down his hammer. Ethan and the dog bounded over gap-toothed smiles and wagging tail, a testament to the morning's triumph. Harper handed them both a cool glass of water condensation dripping down the sides. Luke took a long drink, savoring the relief that came from quenching thirst earned by honest labor. He glanced at Harper and she offered him a glass amber light refracting through the cold liquid. He raised his glass in a makeshift toast. To new fences and new beginnings. She clinked her glass against his. To staying put, she replied, voice warm. Luke allowed himself a small smile as he watched Ethan and the dog tumble in the grass, chasing their own shadows. Around them, the fields of golden wheat shimmered like a sea under the midday sun. He thought of the barn rising behind them, its beams straight and strong once more. He thought of Harper's shy laughter and the way her eyes lingered on him when she thought he wasn't looking. And he thought of the future of days spent repairing fences, nights around bonfires of building something that could last. As they turned to gather their tools, dust kicked up around their boots, swirling in the afternoon light. Luke watched the particles dance in beams of sunlight, settling slowly back to earth. In that haze, he saw more than just work unfinished. He saw possibility, a life rooted in this land, in Harper's steadfast gaze, in his son's carefree grin. A breeze lifted the corner of his jacket, and he caught Harper's eye again. They shared a quiet moment, a look too loaded to dismiss. His heart pounded in his chest, and for once he didn't want to run. He simply let the dust settle around them, feeling the warmth of the day, and the spark between them, knowing that whatever tomorrow held today was enough. Harper's pickup came to a whickering halt just as the dog and Ethan bounded back to them, tongues lolling in the late afternoon sun. Luke Carter wiped sawdust from his brow and tossed the last coil of wire onto the grass. The fence stood straight and proud now, a silent testament to hours of honest work. Around them the wheat fields swayed in golden waves, a soft wind carrying the distant lowing of cows and the promise of evening chores. "Looks good," Harper said, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. She reached out and touched the fence rail lightly, as if greeting an old friend. "Thanks to you." Luke stepped closer, offering her a water bottle, and watched her shoulders relax for a moment. Ethan clasped the dog's collar, trying to keep it still, and Luke crouched to ruffle his son's hair. "Nice work today, champ," he said, smiling down at him. "Ready for supper?" Ethan's grin lit up the field. "Can we have biscuits and gravy?" he asked, boots sinking into soft soil. Harper laughed, a warm sound that alleviated the last of Luke's lingering fatigue. "Biscuits and gravy it is." She turned toward the farmhouse, brush in hand, but paused when the gravel driveway groaned beneath the weight of a sleek black SUV. The engine's hum cut through the pastoral calm like a cynic's sneer. Ethan's laughter stalled as he and the dog watched the vehicle roll to a stop. From the driver's seat, a man emerged, tall, impeccable, in a dark pinstripe suit that looked borrowed from a high-rise boardroom, not a country road. His polished shoes clicked against the gravel, and he carried 2 leather portfolios that gleamed in the sunlight, a promised presence looming on the horizon. Harper stiffened, her hand dropping from the brush. She exchanged a glance with Luke, one silent acknowledgement that whatever this was, it wouldn't be good. The man straightened his tie, smiled with practiced ease, and strode toward them, extending one portfolio as though offering a handshake. "Ms. Monroe, Mr. Carter," he said, voice smooth as oil. "I'm Garrett Sutton, Development Associate with Copperfield Enterprises. Pleasure to meet you." Luke rose to his full height, folding his arms across his chest instinctively. The dog growled low in its throat, and Ethan pulled back, looking to his father for reassurance. Harper's hazel eyes narrowed. "I don't believe we've met," she said, voice cool. "Not yet, but we've been watching," Sutton replied, flicking a glance at the gleaming portfolios. "Your barn, Ms. Monroe. Such a shame to see it in disrepair after generations of history. I've brought something that may interest you." He flipped open the portfolio, revealing stacks of crisp bills and a contract printed on heavy parchment. An acquisition proposal. A most generous offer, if I may say so. Harper's jaw clenched as she stepped forward, keeping her gaze locked on Sutton. "I told you before," she said, voice steady. "This place isn't for sale." Sutton's smile didn't falter. He slipped one portfolio closed and offered the other to Luke instead. "Mr. Carter, you're helping to restore something remarkable here. We value that. We'd like to compensate you as well." He tapped the contract's header. Full-time staff carpenter position benefits included with a salary far above standard rates. No more guest house, living your own cabin on the property fully furnished. Luke's throat tightened. The offer glittered like temptation, enough pay to cover debts and Denver stability for Ethan, maybe even a chance to save for a real home. Yet something in Sutton's tone, a casual disregard for the sweat on Luke's brow, the care in Harper's eyes made the papers feel like shackles rather than promises. Harper took a step forward, hand closing around Luke's sleeve. He felt her pulse quicken beneath his fingers. "We're not interested," she said, voice low but insistent. "Our history isn't measured in dollar signs." Sutton's eyes flicked between them, annoyance flashing for a heartbeat before he masked it with suave politeness. "I understand sentiment truly. But consider what we're offering: modernized barns, upgraded facilities, improved water systems. You'd have resources beyond your wildest dreams." He tapped the portfolio's edge. "All provided. No upfront costs." Luke inhaled, remembering the early mornings of hammering posts into the ground, the quiet dignity of building something with his own hands. He looked at Harper's barn, the beams he'd reset, the fence he'd helped raise each nail, anchoring not just wood to wood, but hope to hope. "I appreciate the offer," he said, voice calm but firm. "But this place isn't just a job for me. It's—" Harper nodded at him, completing his thought. "It's our home," she said. "It's our legacy. We don't need outside money. We need work that respects what's already here." Sutton closed both portfolios with a soft click. "Pity," he murmured, gaze sliding to Ethan, who hugged the dog protectively. "My clients won't wait forever. I'll return in a week with an even better offer." He turned sharply, his coat tail flicking behind him, and climbed into the SUV. Luke's fist clenched around the hammer at his belt, but he resisted the urge to storm forward. Harper squeezed his sleeve again. They watched as the black SUV dissolved back down the gravel lane, dust billowing like a warning. Silence settled over the fields, heavier than the midday heat. Ethan broke the quiet. "Dad, why did he want to buy your barn?" he asked, voice small. Harper crouched beside her son, brushing his hair from his forehead. "People see opportunity, kiddo," she said. "They think in numbers, not feelings." Her gaze drifted to the barn, sun slipping behind its peaked roof. "They don't understand roots." Luke knelt in front of Ethan, placing both hands on his shoulders. "We're not going anywhere," he promised, voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath his skin. "This farm is ours to protect." Across the field, the dog barked, stirring the tall grass. Luke stood, eyes fixed on the fading road. In that moment, he made a silent vow: this fight, Harper's fight, was now his, too. Whatever Sutton brought back in a week, he and Harper would be ready. He would stand guard over this land as fiercely as he had stood guard over his own son's heart. Harper's hand slipped into his fingers, curling around his rough calluses. She looked up at him, vulnerability mingling with resolve in her storm-gray eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. He covered her hand with his own calloused palm. "Always," he said. Together they turned back toward the barn, back toward work that mattered. Overhead the sky stretched wide and unbroken, as if daring them to protect it. And as they crossed the threshold into the place they both called home. Luke Carter knew that some battles, like some loves, were worth every ounce of sweat, every drop of blood, every silent promise made under the sun. The wind shifted without warning, carrying a low, rolling rumble of thunder across the endless pale fields. Luke Carter pulled his jacket tighter around his broad shoulders as he strode toward the tool shed, checking the latches on every door. Beside him, Harper Monroe's hair whipped in the sudden gusts, and she pressed a hand to her brimmed hat, eyes darting to the horizon where ashen clouds billowed like angry waves. The air tasted of ozone and promise, and even before the first drop of rain fell, there was a crackle of electricity that set the hairs on Luke's forearms to standing. "Storm's moving faster than I thought," he said, over his shoulder, voice nearly drowned out by the wind. He reached the shed and wrapped both hands around the rusted handle, twisting until the door creaked open. Inside lay wheelbarrows, jerry cans, and coils of hose things that, if left loose, would soon become airborne missiles. He grabbed the heaviest items first, stacking them against the far wall. Harper joined him inside, dropping a bundle of tarp at Luke's feet. We need to tarp the hay bales, she said, voice tense but sure. And check the feed bins if they flood. We lose everything. She pulled a length of twine from her pocket and began looping it through the tarp's grommets. Luke nodded and bent to help, but a sudden blast of wind rattled the shed's walls. Outside, a sharp crack of thunder shook the ground beneath them like a warning shot. The sky peeled open in angry grays, and the first heavy drops of rain pelted the tin roof with staccato urgency. I'll handle the barn, Luke shouted, hefting a coil of twine over his shoulder as he dashed back outside. Harper tucked the tarp under her arm, and together they surged into the storm. Rain hammered down in sheets, almost horizontal now, stinging their faces and plastering their hair to their foreheads. The wind roared, uprooting dirt and whipping the tall wheat stalks into frantic waves. Luke looped the twine around a stack of hay bales near the barn's side entrance, tying the tarp securely. He paused, water sluicing down his cheeks, to shout to Harper, "How's it look?" "Secure," she yelled back, her voice straining against the gale. She pointed over his shoulder, and Luke spun to see the pasture fence, the very line they'd reinforced just days before, cracking and peeling away under the wind's fury. A horizontal beam had splintered, leaving a gap wide enough for the herd of horses to spill through. Luke's heart lurched. The fence he bellowed and sprinted toward the broken section. Harper followed, abandoning her tarp for the moment. They arrived just as one startled mare tore through the gap, nostrils flaring and hooves pounding the churned earth. A second horse whinnied and followed, then two more panicked, surging through them like wildfire. Luke dove to close the gap, grabbing the broken post with both hands. Rain sluiced down his jacket as he hauled it back toward the others. The wood was slick and splintered, but he jammed it into the soil and braced it with a length of twine that Harper handed him between gusts. Harper knelt by the trembling mare, the rain pelting her back as she murmured soft words of reassurance. She ran a hand along its neck, voice low and melodic. The horse's flanks heaved, muscles rippling beneath a slick hide, but she did not flinch. Instead, she swept her free arm around the animal, guiding it back toward the makeshift pen Luke had steadied. With a grunt, Luke fastened the top loop of twine, pulling the fence wire taut and tying the post firmly in place. He rose and faced the horses, making himself appear as large and steady as he could. "Easy," he called in a calm tone, raising his arms slowly so as not to spook them further. "We've got you." The rain soaked through his shirt, but he barely felt it. His focus narrowed to the horse's wild eyes and shaking legs. One by one, encouraged by Harper's gentle coaxing and Luke's looming presence, they stepped back through the gap into the shivering enclosure. Ethan's earlier laughter of chasing the dog felt a lifetime ago. A jagged bolt of lightning split the sky overhead, flooding the pasture with blinding white light and a deafening clap of thunder. Luke reflexively stepped backward and yanked Harper out of the fence's path, colliding with her in a tangle of arms and hearts pounding in unison. Their breath came in sharp gasps, moisture-laden and mingling in the storm's raw fury. They clung together for a moment, eyes wide, bodies pressed tight against the howling wind. Luke's hand found Harper's waist, fingers twisting into the fabric of her shirt as if anchoring them both to solidity. Harper's palm rested against his chest, feeling the rapid drumbeat of his heart beneath thick denim. "Are you—" Luke began, but the words were lost under the thunder's roar. Harper forced a laugh that cracked on her lips, but her eyes shone with relief. "I'm fine," she shouted, stepping back just enough to look up at him. Rain streamed down her storm-gray eyes, tracing rivulets across her cheeks like rivets of courage. "You saved me." He shook his head. Concern and something else, something warmer, flickering through his gaze. "Should have been paying attention," he said, voice low. "I'm sorry." She brushed a strand of drenched hair from her face as Luke straightened. "You didn't have to," she started, but thunder cut her off again, and she tucked a trembling hand behind her ear, steadying herself on the fence rail. Luke reached out and caught her hand before she could turn away. "I've got you," he said, each word deliberate and sure. He stepped closer, so close that her breath came mingled with his own, warm against the chill blowing across the pasture. She took a shaky breath, shoulders drooping as adrenaline gave way to something like calm. "Thank you," she breathed. He offered a faint, grateful smile, though his shirt clung to his chest and every muscle sang with fatigue. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the barn's cover at last. "Let's get inside before this roof blows off." Together they guided the last of the horses to safety, ensuring each animal settled back into the pen without further panic. Ethan's small voice called from the barn's open doors he'd crept out with a flashlight, watching from beneath the shelter. Luke shot him a quick thumbs up, then turned back to Harper. She brushed rain from her face, trying to shake off the chill. "We're lucky," she said, and her voice wavered just a fraction. "Could have been worse." Luke nodded, wrapping an arm around her shoulders and steering her back toward the barn. The structure groaned and creaked under the storm's assault, but it held. They burst inside water, sluicing off their clothes onto the wooden floor. Ethan ran to them, wide-eyed, clutching his rabbit toy like a lifeline. "Dad Harper." "You guys okay?" he asked, voice small. Luke knelt and hugged him tight, then glanced up at Harper. She smiled, brushing mud from her jeans. "We're okay," she told Ethan. "Just a little excitement." The barn's interior was dim but dry, the air thick with hay and warmth. Harper found a pair of towels and tossed one to Luke. As he patted himself dry, she wrapped the other around Ethan's shoulders. The little boy's teeth chattered faintly, but he grinned, undaunted. Luke leaned against a beam, catching his breath. He looked across the barn at Harper, whose eyes caught his in a way that said more than any words could. The storm outside raged on, but here beneath shelter, they stood side by side, partners in every sense. He thought of how far he'd come from a roadside breakdown, to a makeshift home, from a solitary itinerant carpenter, to someone with a son and a future worth fighting for. And in that moment, with Harper's hand on his arm and the horse's soft knickers drifting through the wooden walls, he felt something fierce and undeniable swell in his chest. "You all right?" Harper asked softly, stepping closer. He nodded, voice thick with emotion. "More than I've been in a long time." He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Thank you for everything." She pressed his hand against her heart. "We'll be all right," she said, a promise in her tone. Outside, the thunder continued its relentless march across the sky, and lightning sketched white-hot veins through the clouds. But inside the barn, warm with shared resolve, Luke Carter and Harper Monroe faced the storm together, steady, unbroken, and unafraid. Night had settled over the farm like a velvet cloak, the storm's fury reduced to distant rumbles fading into the horizon. Luke Carter stepped out onto the back porch, the boards creaking beneath his boots. He could still taste the sharp tang of adrenaline in his mouth, mingling with the earth's damp musk. Beside him, Harper Monroe held 2 short glasses of amber whiskey, each swirling with ice that clinked softly in the quiet night air. She offered one to Luke, her fingers brushing his just for an instant, enough to send a warm spark through his chest. "Here," she said, voice low, steady, "for surviving the storm." He accepted the glass and raised it in a silent toast. The liquid burned as it slid down his throat, a comforting fire against the chill the rain had left behind. Lightning had vanished, replaced by a clear sky, spangled with stars so bright they seemed to hover just above the treetops. The farmhouse lights cast a soft golden glow over the porch, illuminating the weathered planks and the few chairs they'd arranged in a conversational arc. They sank into those chairs, Luke on the left and Harper on the right, elbows on knees, glasses cradled in their hands. For a while they only listened, the wind whispering through the nearby pines, the distant lowing of cows settling for the night, and the soft patter of drying leaves. Finally, Harper exhaled and set her glass on the railing. She wrapped her fingers around it, knuckles whitening. "I've spent most of my life out here," she began, eyes fixed on a single star that wavered in the porch light. "Fighting for this place against developers, against drought, against anything that threatened to take it away." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Luke leaned forward, concern knitting his brow. "What happened?" he asked gently. She looked over at him, then eyes weary, and took a slow sip before answering. "Every time I let someone in my heart, my trust, they ended up leaving. My mom and dad passed when I was young, then my grandpa, and every friend I made who thought I was crazy for staying left too. Promises, broken words unkept. So eventually I stopped letting people get close." Luke watched her silhouette, the way her shoulders hunched as if burdened by invisible weight. He thought of his own scars. Emily's smile flickering in his mind, the hospital's cold corridors, Ethan's small hand searching for reassurance. He understood fear of loss better than most. He set his glass on the bench between them and reached for her hand. "Harper," he said, voice soft enough that her name sounded like a plea. "You don't have to face those battles alone anymore." She pulled her hand back as if stung eyes flicking away. The wind stirred her hair, lifting stray strands like whispered secrets. "I'm used to being alone," she said, voice brittle. "Alone is safe. Alone I know what to expect. Let someone in and you risk losing more than land. You risk losing yourself." Luke's chest ached at her words. He reached out again, more tentatively this time, tracing a line on the wood between them. "I'm not going anywhere," he repeated. "Ethan and I, this farm, it's our home. I'm here to stay." Her eyes found his in the dim light, and for a moment the porch vanished. There was only his steady gaze, her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Her defenses quivered as if a hairline crack had turned into a full fracture. Luke felt it too, the tender edge of hope, the terrifying promise of more than he'd ever allowed himself to want. He moved forward, closing the gap by inches until his knee nearly brushed hers. She inhaled sharply, the motion catching in her throat. He lifted his hand, fingertips hovering before his chest. When his flesh almost brushed hers, she drew back, pulling her knees tight against her body. She began, voice quivering. Then she shook her head as if trying to dislodge a painful thought. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm not good at this." Luke's heart stuttered. He swallowed down the rush of disappointment and laid his hand flat on the porch floor beside hers instead. The closeness was enough to feel her warmth, the residual thunder of her pulse. "It's okay," he said softly. "I understand." She cast her eyes down, staring at the grain of the wood, a silent battle waging behind her lashes. Luke could almost see her memories, everyone she'd lost, every promise broken, shadow dancing behind her gaze. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this earlier," he said, voice gentle. "It's nothing fancy, but I wanted you to have it." Harper's brows knitted as she looked from his hand to the paper. He slid it across the wood to her, and she unfolded it with trembling fingers. Inside were 3 lines written in Luke's careful script. "I choose you. I choose this land. I choose us, no matter how hard the fight." She blinked as though waking from a dream, and the words trembled in her grasp. Luke leaned forward, eyes unwavering. "You don't have to fight alone. Let me stand with you." Tears glimmered in her storm-gray eyes. Her jaw trembled, caught between fear and longing. When she looked back at him, the walls she'd built around her heart shuddered, and a single tear broke free, tracing a path down her cheek. She began, voice hoarse and bitter lip. The moment stretched between them, suspended in the night air. Then she closed the paper, folded it once, twice, and slipped it into her pocket. Her hand found Luke's on the porch floor, hesitating before covering it with a tentative pressure. He inhaled sharply at the contact, her fingertips seeking his fingertips, a fragile bridge spanning the chasm of her fears. "I'm scared," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can do this, letting someone in believing they'll stay." Luke's chest tightened, but he kept his voice gentle. "I'll stay," he said. "Every day you have to remind yourself that I'm here, I'll be." Harper lifted her head, and in her storm-gray eyes he saw gratitude, relief, and that flicker of something more. Something neither wanted to name just yet. She took a slow breath, leaning forward, until her other hand joined the first, encasing his in hers. Their fingers curled together, a small defiance against the loneliness she'd known for too long. Luke edged closer still, mind telling him to wait to let her set the pace, but something in her softened surrender pulled him forward. Their foreheads brushed, breath mingling in the cool night, and for an instant time held its breath. Then reality closed in. Harper's eyes fluttered open, panic sharpening her gaze. She drew back with a shaking laugh, standing abruptly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I can't." Luke's heart lurched, but he stayed seated, watching her retreat to the far end of the porch. She wrapped her arms around herself, knees drawn tight as if protecting a wounded heart. Luke set his glass on the railing unused and rose to follow her, hands raised in peace. "Harper," he said softly, stepping into the dim circle of porch light. "It's okay. We'll take this slow. We'll go at your pace." She shut her eyes, pressing her back against the wall, and nodded once, sharply. "Okay," she echoed, voice distant, slow. Luke exhaled relief, mingling with an ache that wouldn't fade. He turned and retrieved his glass, raising it toward her in a quiet toast. Harper watched him for a moment. then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. They didn't speak again that night. Instead, Luke sat in the empty chair she'd vacated, whiskey glass cradled between his hands, and watched her through the porch's soft glow. He saw her silhouette etched against the farmhouse window, and he understood her walls had begun to crumble, but she'd not yet learned to lean on someone else's strength. A soft breeze rattled the porch rail, and Luke let the night's calm settle around him. He would wait, patient, unwavering, for her fears to ease, for her trust to grow, for her hand to slip back into his without the tremor of doubt. And in the silent communion of that porch under the starlit sky, he vowed once more he was there to stay, come what may. The morning sun slanted through the kitchen window, catching dust motes and golden shafts as Harper Monroe unfolded the county notice across her grandmother's maple table. The paper crackled between her fingers, its stark lettering spelling out words she had never wanted to see. Notice of intent to exercise eminent domain. She stared at the paragraph that followed, heart pounding so hard she thought she might collapse right there into her wooden chair. They're taking it, she whispered, voice raw. Her fingers trembled against the paper as she read on Garrett Sutton's name, inked into every line, the county officials complicit in a plot to seize her land for public redevelopment. Public redevelopment, he'd called it, a golf course, luxury homes, a shopping center, places empty of history, hollow of meaning. She dropped the notice, letting it slide to the floor, and pressed her palms flat to the table as if to keep the world from spinning off its hinges. Luke Carter stood in the doorway, toolbox in hand, fresh from the barn. He paused at the sight of Harper's ashen face. "What is it?" he asked, voice gentle. Harper looked up, eyes wide and haunted. She reached for the notice, her knuckles white. "Eminent domain," she said, words jagged. "They're seizing the farm, Luke. They filed it yesterday under Garrett's influence. He's enlisted the county to force me out." Luke's chest tightened. He set the toolbox down with a thud that echoed through the room. He leaned forward and scooped up the notice, scanning the dense legalese. His jaw clenched, and then in a motion born of fury and protection, he slammed the paper onto the table. The wooden top rattled under the impact. "They can't do this," he said, voice low and hard. "Not if we don't let them." Harper's eyes glittered with tears she refused to shed. She rose and began pacing, hands clenched at her sides. "They don't need my permission," she said, voice brittle. "Eminent domain means they can just take it, claim it's for the public good. Garrett's pulling the strings. He's betrayed me. Betrayed this land." Luke followed her lead, moving to stand beside her. He laid a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Then we fight," he said, each word deliberate. "We'll marshal every tool, legal, personal, whatever it takes to defend your home. You're not alone in this, Harper. I'm with you." She closed her eyes at his words as if drinking them in, but the tremor in her shoulders betrayed her fear. Luke gathered the papers and stuffed them into his jacket pocket. "I'll call my friend Jenna. She's a lawyer in Austin. She knows eminent domain cases. We'll get her out here today." Harper shook her head. "It's too late. The notice says 3 days until the hearing. They'll bulldoze this place before you can blink." Luke's face hardened. "Then we'll be ready in 3 days." He reached out and took her hand. "We'll get affidavits from neighbors' testimony about the farm's history, any legal grounds to challenge it. And if Garrett thinks he can bully you with county officials, he hasn't met the wrong people yet." Her gaze met his. There was a tremor there, a flicker of hope shadowed by panic. She swallowed hard. "I don't know how," she admitted. "I've never fought something like this before." He squeezed her hand gently. "Then you won't have to learn alone." He leaned close, voice quiet but fierce. "I promise you, Harper Monroe, nobody messes with your legacy while I'm standing here." For a moment, Harper's defenses wavered. She pressed her forehead to his chest, listening to the steady thump of his heart, an anchor in the chaos. Outside, a breeze rattled the kitchen window as though the wind itself had carried his vow into her soul. When she finally looked up, her eyes were clear. "Okay," she said, voice steady. "Okay, let's do it." By mid-morning, the Monroe farmhouse had transformed into a makeshift command center. Luke sat at the table, head bent over his laptop, drafting emails to Jenna and other legal contacts. Harper sorted through old photographs and deeds, centuries of family history she intended to band together into a defense dossier. Ethan perched on the edge of the table, rabbit toy in hand, watching his parents with wide eyes. Mom, what's eminent domain? He asked, voice small. Harper ruffled his hair. It means they think they can take our farm and use it for something else, baby. But we're going to stop them. Ethan's brow furrowed as if weighing her words. Like when you and Dad saved the barn from falling down. Luke smiled, ruffling his son's hair. Yeah, sweetheart, we're saving this place too. Reassured Ethan scampered off to collect his tools and help Harper box old ledgers and letters from neighbors, handwritten notes praising the farm's place in community life. Harper carefully tied each package with twine and labeled it Community Support, Historical Value, Economic Contribution. She and Luke exchanged determined glances. They were stacking every possible defense. An hour later, Jenna's crisp voice crackled through the laptop's speaker. Luke, I'm on my way, she said. I'll be there in 4 hours. In the meantime, get me everything you've got on the farm's history. Deeds, tax records, affidavits, your lease agreement. If we can show this isn't truly for public use, we can push back. Luke glanced at Harper, who nodded and returned to her piles of documents. Consider it done, he replied. After placing the call, Luke stood and moved to the doorway, scanning the rolling fields beyond. The fence they'd rebuilt ran straight as an arrow, a lifeline to hope. He remembered the day Garrett Sutton arrived smooth as a snake, offering cash and false promises. Now Garrett's real plan was laid bare, corporate greed backed by government power. And Luke's blood burned at the thought of the man's betrayal. He crossed to Harper's side and wrapped an arm around her. She rested her head on his shoulder. Thank you, she whispered. He kissed the top of her head. We'll win this, he vowed. For your grandpa, for our future, for Ethan. They won't win. That afternoon, Luke and Harper set out to enlist the local community. They climbed into his truck, Harper handing out copies of a flyer crafted in haste, Defend Monroe Farm public hearing in 3 days. It listed the time, place, and a call for all neighbors, friends, and anyone who believed in preserving the land's legacy to attend. They drove down dusty lanes, stopping at neighboring farms and inviting local storekeepers, teachers, and old-timers who'd grown up attending dances in the barn. Each time Harper's voice wavered slightly, but Luke's steady presence strengthened her resolve. At Miller's Feed and Supply, Mr. Miller clasped Harper's hands with tears in his eyes. Your grandpa was a good man. We owe him this support. He wrote a statement and promised to testify. By sundown, their stack of affidavits and signed petitions was as tall as Harper's elbow. Luke parked the truck by the barn, and they climbed out tired but triumphant. The fields glowed gold in the evening light, and Ethan ran ahead chasing a late paper kite they'd brought for him, his laughter rising like a prayer. Harper turned to Luke, eyes shining. I never thought I'd see this, she said, voice thick. All these people's standing with me. He took her hand and led her to the porch where they watched their son play. It's never just your fight, he said. You're part of something bigger. She leaned into him and he wrapped his arms around her, feeling her breath slow, her pulse calm. In that moment, the county notice on the kitchen floor felt less like a death sentence and more like a call to arms, a betrayal transformed into a rallying cry. Together, they had reshaped fear into action, turned loneliness into community. As dusk deepened and the first stars blinked overhead, Luke kissed Harper's temple. Tomorrow, he said softly, we prepare for the hearing. She nodded, resting her head against his chest. And we win. He held her close, watching Ethan's kite dip and soar in the twilight breeze, and knew that whatever Garrett Sutton and his cronies had planned, they hadn't counted on two things: the fierce heart of a Monroe and the unyielding promise of a carpenter who refused to walk away. The early morning light slanted through the narrow windows of the county courthouse, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Luke Carter and Harper Monroe sat side by side in the front row, their shoulders touching lightly, a silent reassurance against the nervous energy humming through the packed room. Around them, farmers in faded denim shopkeepers in crisp shirts and neighbors of every stripe filled the gallery, clutching petitions and letters, their faces lined with worry but resolute. At the front, a polished attorney in a charcoal gray suit tapped his briefcase, calling the courtroom to order. Your Honor. He began, voice smooth and authoritative. Copperfield Enterprises and its associates submit that the Monroe property constitutes an underutilized asset. Under Section 124 of the County Redevelopment Act, the proposed mixed-use project, residential, commercial, and recreational, serves a clear public interest by creating jobs, increasing tax revenue, and providing affordable housing. He gestured to a projector screen showing sleek renderings of townhouses and shopping plazas cradled between manicured lawns and tree-lined streets. This plan revitalizes the county's economy, addresses housing shortages, and repurposes land that has sat fallow for decades. The farm, while sentimental to some, does not maximize the potential of this prime real estate. A murmur of polite applause drifted from the developer's table. Luke felt Harper's hand tighten around his. He glanced at her. Her jaw was set, her storm-gray eyes flashing. When the attorney sat down, she rose with the poise of someone used to standing alone in the fields. The courtroom fell silent. "Your Honor." Harper began, her voice calm but unwavering. "The Monroe Farm is not an underutilized asset. It is the heartbeat of this community." She held up a stack of letters bound with twine. "These are from friends and neighbors, teachers, grocers, mechanics, people whose livelihoods depend on the crops grown here, on the livestock we raise, on the seasonal workers who find their weekend jobs at harvest." She handed one letter to the bailiff for the judge's review. Each of these voices testifies to the farm's ongoing contribution. Food supplies to the local school lunches, hay for the county fair's prize livestock, raw produce for our farmers market. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The judge, a stern-faced woman in robes, nodded for her to continue. Harper turned to face the audience. "My grandfather built this barn with his own hands after returning from war. My parents taught me to respect this land. When drought came, we irrigated. When fences fell, we repaired them. This farm feeds more than cattle. It feeds hope. It feeds tradition. It feeds a sense of belonging that no shopping center can replace." Soft sniffs rose from the gallery. A neighbor dabbed at her eyes. Harper drew a steadying breath. "I'm not against progress," she said, voice trembling. "But progress that bulldozes history, that uproots families who have tilled this soil for generations, achieves nothing but short-term gain at the cost of community resilience." She sat, and a tangible hush fell. The developer's attorney rose again, adjusting his cuffs. "Miss Monroe's sentiment is commendable, but it does not override the public good. Revenues projected exceed maintenance costs by 300%, and the community will benefit from the influx of business and infrastructure." Luke stood before the defense table, shifting the weight of his boots on the scuffed wooden floor. He swallowed the lump in his throat and stepped forward. "Your Honor, members of the board," he said, voice steady though his heart thundered. "I'm not a lawyer, I'm a carpenter. I came here looking for work and found a home that my son and I deserve. But today I stand here because I believe in more than profit margins. I believe in roots." He paused, letting the word resonate. "When I first drove onto Harper's farm, my truck broke down. But it wasn't just a broken axle I found here. I found a chance to rebuild my life, to ground Ethan in something real. I've seen this land feed families, create jobs for harvest hands whose children go to our schools. I've seen neighbors donate hay for shelters in the winter. I've seen community picnics under the barn's rafters. That's more than underutilized. It's the lifeblood of a county that needs more than new roofs and brick facades." Luke lifted his gaze to the judge. "Take this farm away from us, and you take away the promise of second chances, the heritage of hard work, the stories that bind us together. You replace them with sterile developments and empty streets at night. I've built things all my life, fences, barns, tables for families to gather around. But the most important thing I've helped build here is community, and that is priceless." He returned to his seat as gentle applause rippled through the gallery. The developer's attorney looked momentarily off balance, pressing his lips together before regaining composure. He rose for a final rebuttal, but his words rang hollow compared to the conviction that filled the room. The judge consulted her notes, then looked out at the crowd. "I appreciate the heartfelt testimony presented today on both sides. This is a complex matter involving economic development and preservation of heritage. I will review these arguments and the submitted evidence. A ruling will be issued within 2 weeks." A collective breath seemed to release as murmurs spread through the courtroom. Luke reached for Harper's hand beneath the seat fingers, interlacing in gratitude and relief. She turned to him, eyes shining with unshed tears and fierce pride. Outside, the late afternoon sun was waning, the sky painted in strokes of pink and orange. The courthouse steps were crowded with voices, neighbors offering congratulations, photographers from the local paper capturing smiles, attorneys shaking hands with witnesses. Amid the chaos, Luke and Harper stood side by side, their shoulders aligned as if forming an unbreakable wall. Harper leaned her head on Luke's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. He kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for fighting, and for letting me stand with you." They watched as Ethan, flushed with excitement, waved from the front steps, clutching a small sign reading "Save Monroe Farm." In that moment, uncertainty still lingered 2 more weeks before the judge's decision, but for the first time the threat of losing everything felt surmountable. Together they had faced the courtroom scrutiny and shown that home and history are worth more than any profit. And as the gathered crowd began to break apart under the glow of dusk, Luke Carter and Harper Monroe walked down the courthouse steps hand in hand, ready to weather whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that when roots run deep, they can withstand any storm. The morning sun hadn't yet burned away the lavender haze when Harper Monroe found Luke standing at the edge of the barnyard, staring at his phone, as though his life depended on the words on its screen. She crossed the yard in quick steps, her heart drumming with the same anxious hope that had accompanied every long night since Garrett Sutton first threatened to seize the farm. "I've got it," Luke said, voice strangely hushed. He slipped the phone into his pocket and turned to her, eyes bright with relief. "The judge denied the eminent domain claim. The farm is ours officially." For a moment, Harper simply stared at him as if willing the words to sink in. Then the tension gave way, flooding her chest like a sudden storm dissolving into sunshine. She reached out and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face into his soaked work shirt. "We did it," she whispered, voice thick. "We actually did it." Luke lifted her, spinning her once before setting her back to solid ground. "No," he corrected, voice warm and soft. "You did it. You and everyone who stood by you." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I just helped carry the load." Harper pulled back enough to look him in the eye, that storm-gray intensity softened now by tears and triumph. "I couldn't have carried it at all without you," she said, and her lips curved in a shaky smile as she stepped closer. Behind them, the farm seemed to exhale. The barn's newly patched shutters gleamed in the morning light. The fence lines that they'd rebuilt stood straight and strong, and even the horses in the pasture ambled quietly as if attuned to the shift in atmosphere. Among the rows of corn and wheat neighbors began to appear Mr. Miller from the feed store waving his hat, the Wilson family holding a plate of freshly baked biscuits. Old Mrs. Alvarez, her cheeks rose with pride as she brought a basket of plums from her orchard. Luke and Harper exchanged a glance that said everything words couldn't. Together they strode toward the farmhouse, hands linked as cheers and laughter followed in their wake. Ethan raced ahead, rabbit toy bouncing in his arms, flanked by local children who'd spent the night sleeping under hay bales in solidarity. When he reached his parents, he threw himself into both of their arms, squealing, "You saved the day!" Harper knelt to scoop him into her lap, brushing grass from his hair. "We saved our home, buddy," she said, pressing her cheek to his. He giggled, and Luke crouched beside them, planting a kiss on Ethan's forehead. "And you helped too," he added. "You made this place better just by being here." As the sun climbed, a potluck breakfast emerged on the farmhouse porch, stacks of biscuits, jars of preserves, plates of scrambled eggs and bacon sizzling on warming stones. Harper and Luke moved down the line like honored guests, thanking each neighbor in turn, their hearts swelling with a pride that felt as nourishing as any meal. Laughter and conversation wove among them. Memories of the fight, hopes for the future, plans to expand the barn's dance nights next season. By midday, the festivities began to wind down. Harper found herself back at the porch's edge, cradling a steaming mug of coffee. Luke joined her, pulling a chair beside hers. Between them, a vase of wildflowers Luke had picked that morning glowed in the sun. They sipped in companionable silence, watching Ethan chase fireflies across the lawn, their delicate lights flickering like tiny beacons of joy. Harper leaned into Luke's shoulder, inhaling the scent of his linen shirt mixed with morning air. "I can't believe how light everything feels," she said finally. "I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop." Luke tilted her chin up, brushing his thumb across her cheek. "No more waiting," he promised. "We've got this place for good now." He lifted his coffee mug in a small toast. "To Monroe Farm, home sweet home." Harper returned the toast, her lips brushing the rim. When she looked up, Luke's eyes shone with something more, an invitation loaded with unspoken promises. She felt the gentle pull of his gaze, the warmth in his tone, and her own heart responded without hesitation. "Luke," she whispered, voice trembling in anticipation. He set his mug down and reached for her hand. Their fingers intertwined, and for a moment the world narrowed to the two of them on that sunlit porch, the hum of farm life a distant echo. Luke rose and offered her his hand. "Come with me," he said softly. Harper smiled, curiosity and delight sparkling in her eyes as she took his hand. He led her down the porch steps across the flagstone path and into the arms of a golden field where the fireflies drifted like living lanterns. The sky overhead was a canvas of gentle lavender streaked with clouds, tinted rose by the setting sun. Luke stopped and turned to face her, his eyes reflecting that soft glow. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, and she leaned into the touch, her breath catching as his fingers lingered. They stood just a breath apart, the field around them alive with summer's lullaby, the distant low of cattle, the rustle of leaves, the electric buzz of fireflies. Luke's hand slid to Harper's waist, drawing her closer, and her free arm rose to rest against his chest, fingers splaying against his shirt where her heart pounded beneath. Their eyes met and held, each searching the other's gaze for permission. Then, with the tender inevitability of dawn, Luke leaned in. His lips met hers in a kiss both slow and fervent, a release of everything they'd held back through storms and courtrooms and sleepless nights. The world hushed around them, and the lavender sky dipped its colors lower, as if bowing to their union. Harper's arms rose to loop around his neck, bringing him even closer. Her fingers tangled in his hair as she deepened the kiss, tasting the sweetness of relief, of victory, of love finally laid bare. When they parted, breaths mingling and hearts racing, Luke pressed his forehead to hers. "I've wanted that for so long," he murmured, voice husky with emotion. Harper traced his jaw with her fingertips, tears shining like dew in her eyes. "So have I," she admitted. "More than I ever let myself believe I could." He smiled, brushing his lips across her brow, then her temple. "We'll have plenty of time to believe now," he said. "Here, where everything matters." She rested her cheek against him, listening to the steady beat of his heart, the fireflies dancing around them in a silent benediction. Together they watched as the lavender dusk deepened into a velvet night, lit by 1,000 glowing wings, a perfect ending to a chapter forged in struggle, sealed with resilience and crowned by their long-awaited vulnerability. And in that field of fireflies, with the farm safe beneath them, and the promise of tomorrow shining as brightly as the stars above, Luke Carter and Harper Monroe knew they were finally home. The sun rose in a rosy haze over Monroe Farm, painting the freshly rebuilt barn in shades of rose gold. Luke Carter wiped his brow as he stepped out of the new woodworking shop, inhaling the rich scent of sawdust and pine that now mingled with morning dew. Behind him, the rhythmic hum of sanders and the steady tap of chisels echoed from inside, where he shaped oak boards into fence posts and farmhouse furniture that would last generations. The shop's open doors welcomed each breeze, carrying with it the promise of fresh beginnings. Ethan Carter, barefoot and carefree, darted through the emerald rows of young corn, his laughter trailing behind him like a ribbon. He bent to examine a ladybug perched on a leaf, its red shell glistening in the dawn light, before sprinting off again to chase a butterfly dancing between stalks. Luke watched his son's boundless energy and felt a swell of pride. These fields were no longer just land. They were the backdrop to Ethan's happiest memories, a far cry from the cramped apartment they once knew. Across the yard, Harper Monroe stood on the grain bin surveying the morning's work. The barn's new timbers gleamed sturdily beneath its metal roof, each plank and beam a testament to sweat-earned renewal. A row of planters she'd installed beneath the windows now brimmed with bright marigolds and trailing vines, her way of celebrating life's resilience. She climbed down, boots crunching on gravel, and waved to Luke, who gave a confident thumbs up. Then she headed toward the greenhouse by the chicken coop to check on seedlings sprouting in neat rows. By mid-morning, neighbors began to drift in Mr. Miller with fresh hay bales, Mrs. Alvarez bearing jars of plum jam, and the Wilson children clutching wildflower bouquets. They gathered beneath the shade of the old oak tree beside the barn, where a long picnic table groaned under the weight of homemade breads, pies, and a steaming kettle of lemonade. The chatter was easy, friendly. Conversations wove through plans for harvest dances in the barn loft and rotating work schedules in the fields. It felt less like a gathering to commemorate victory and more like an ordinary Wednesday morning, an ordinary miracle. Luke emerged from his shop carrying a set of handcrafted rocking chairs he'd built for the wraparound porch. He set them down beside two wide benches and ran a hand along the smooth armrests. "Made these for us," he said, voice warm. "Needed somewhere comfy to sit with my favorite people." Harper smiled, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. Ethan bounded over, curious, and climbed into one of the chairs, testing its gentle sway. He giggled as the chair creaked under his weight. Harper slipped her hand into Luke's, and together they watched as their world unfolded. The community they'd galvanized the barn restored to its former glory, and then some, the workshop humming with purpose. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "It's more than I dared dream," she murmured. He kissed the top of her head. "You dreamed it first," he replied. "All I did was help build it." Later that afternoon, Luke called Ethan into the workshop. The boy's eyes widened at the sight of a small wooden model house Luke had crafted, complete with a tiny wraparound porch and miniature rocking chairs. "This is for you," Luke said, handing the model across the workbench. "My gift to the best helper a dad could ask for." Ethan traced the delicate windows with his fingertip, then looked up at his father, eyes bright. "It's perfect," he said softly. Harper joined them, placing a plate of freshly baked cookies on the bench. "For our master carpenter," she teased, and Luke laughed as he accepted a cookie. The three of them shared a quiet moment, the afternoon light slanting through the shop's open doorway, spotlighting their contentment. As evening approached, the sky deepened to lavender, and the first fireflies winked on in the tall grass. Luke and Harper stepped onto the wraparound porch with 2 mugs of cocoa, hers dusted with cinnamon, his with a swirl of cream. They sank into the rocking chairs, the gentle motion lulling them into a calm hush. Ethan flitted around them, chasing fireflies with a jar in his small hands, his joyous cries echoing across the farm. Harper's hand found Luke's again, their fingers knitting together. "Remember when we first met on that lonely road?" she asked, voice soft. He nodded, eyes on the horizon where the sun dipped its last rays behind rolling fields. "I thought I was running from everything he said, but I ended up finding what I needed most." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "A fresh start," she mused. "Not just for us, but for so many people. This place isn't just my family's legacy anymore. It's everyone's hometown." His arm tightened around her. "And it's ours," he said. "Together." They sat in companionable silence as the twilight deepened, the gentle creak of the rocking chairs blending with the rustle of leaves and distant calls of crickets. The barn doors stood open, a sliver of lantern light spilling onto the grass, ready for the community dance they'd planned next weekend. The workshop behind them glowed warmly, evidence that Luke's promise to build a life here had taken shape in wood and nails and heartfelt labor. Ethan's voice drifted up to them. "Mom, Dad, look." He held up his jar triumphantly. Inside, dozens of fireflies blinked softly, casting a flickering glow across his wide grin. Harper and Luke chuckled and rose, meeting him halfway, and Luke carefully lifted the jar to his lap so he could join in the delight. The three of them bent close, marveling at the tiny lights, their faces aglow in the lavender dusk. Harper kissed Ethan's forehead, then looked up at Luke, eyes reflecting both firefly light and the gathering night sky. "We did good, didn't we?" she whispered. He nodded. "We did great." He guided the jar toward a nearby sapling and opened the lid, letting the fireflies climb free. As they drifted upward, their glow scattered through the twilight like living stars. Luke and Harper watched them go, hearts full. Harper slipped her hand into Luke's again as they watched the last fireflies vanish into the darkening sky. Beneath them, the barn, the shop, the fields. They were no longer separate pieces, but one seamless tapestry of home, the legacy of her family. The fresh start he'd found, their son's laughter weaving it all together. This was the foundation they'd built, stronger than any steel beam. And as the final ember of sunlight faded, they remained on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, content in the knowledge that here on this land they had fought to preserve their roots would only grow deeper with every sunrise to come.